Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve Cutway. And coincidentally, Steve's name will pop up during this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you're a musician or a music lover and you've lived in Kingston for a while, you'll enjoy this episode. We track a little history through the eyes of an internationally famous recording engineer who's a great storyteller. Such a great storyteller, we'll need 2 episodes to cover his career so far. In part 1, we'll start with the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show and work our way to Todd Rundgren at the O'Keefe Centre in Toronto. Our guest is Doug McClement. Doug, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Thanks very much for your time today. And so after 40 years in the business, over 4,000 recordings, a long list of accomplishments, it all starts here in Kingston when you picked up a guitar in the mid-60s and went from there.
Yeah, well, I'm of that generation that I was about 11, I guess, when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is kind of like the big cosmic lever change for a lot of us. It's amazing how many interviews you read with guys in their 60s who that was the moment they became interested in music. And I remember seeing that, and I was in grade 6 at the time at Loyalist Senior Public School, which was in the building that LCDI is now, and it was before they built Calvin Park. And coming into school the next day, and the principal saying, "Well, I'm sure some of you kids saw that noise that was on television last night, and we have a concert this morning by the Vimy military band in the gymnasium, and those people are going to be around a lot longer than that noise that you saw last night. And if anybody comes to school with hair that long, they're going to be sent home immediately." It was like the barbarians were at the gates or something, which of course made it even more appealing to us. And I remember getting my mom thinking, "Gee, my Uncle Jack has a guitar in the closet at his house." And I got my mom to drive me over to my uncle's place and got that acoustic guitar. And we stopped at Stafford's Music on Princess Street on the way home and got an easy chord book. And I started taking lessons there every Saturday. So that was my start in the music business. And then by the time I was about 13 or 14, I got a part-time job at International Sounds, which was a stereo store out at the Frontenac Mall, the old Frontenac Mall across from Collins Bay Penn there. Mm-hmm. And they sold tape decks and stereo systems and speakers. And so I bought a reel-to-reel tape deck out of my $1.35 an hour income there, and started taping. I got into little bands in grade 8 and 9. We'd play house parties for friends at high school and at LCDI and KCVI. And I started taping the band I was in, and word got around town that I had this tape recorder. And some of the other bands started calling me up and saying, "Hey, would you come out and tape our group? We're playing at Frontenac High School this weekend, and could you bring your tape deck out and tape us live?" So I became kind of known. There were no recording studios in Kingston in at this time in 68, 69. So I started setting up a little 4-track studio in my parents' basement in Calvin Park, and started bringing bands in. Our band was rehearsing there anyway, so we had a drum kit and we had a bass amp and stuff. So bands would come into the house, and I remember doing commercials for the Inn of Shoes, and I remember going down and recording the St. George's Anglican Choir at St. George's Cathedral when the King's College Choir came from England and performed. I was set up inside the organ loft with my little tape deck and recording things like that, and recording the Kingston Symphony up in the at City Hall upstairs in one of the areas there. So I started getting involved a little bit in the Kingston music scene through that.
What was the scene like in terms of musicians during that period?
Better than you would think for a city of 50,000 people, simply because of the proximity of Kingston to Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, meant that there were a lot of bands coming through from those big towns, and they were good musicians, and the Kingston musicians had to up their game a bit if they wanted to get work, because they're always being compared with the Toronto and Montreal bands. So there were a number of really good bands based in Kingston, and good players. And there was work because of the university and our MC. There was places for us to play, and so something that's important to remember is then the drinking age was still 21, and so the majority of Queen's students and RMC students and St. Lawrence College students couldn't legally drink in bars at that point. So there wasn't much of a bar scene for Kingston bands, but there certainly was a high school dances and college dances at RMC in Queens. There was lots of places to play for those bands. And it was almost all booked by one agency. There was an agency in Kingston run by a gentleman named Bernie Dobbin, and all the Kingston bands booked through Bernie. And he had pretty well a lock on everything that was happening between Trenton and Cornwall, south of Arnprior. That was kind of Bernie Dobbin territory. And he had the exclusive booking for most of the high schools, colleges, and bars in that area at the time.
Any particular musicians stand out in your memory?
One of the, almost every instrument. We had one really good player. Chris McCann on drums was as good as anybody in the country. Tim Mavidi on guitar, the late, great Tim Mavidi, who ended up teaching guitar in Kingston and taught probably half the guitar players in Kingston. Mike Myers, who's still active in the Kingston music scene, great friend, one of my first recording clients. I remember Mike recording at my parents' house, when I had the studio in the basement. We had the piano upstairs, and he's upstairs with the headphones on playing on my mom's piano, and I'm downstairs at the tape deck. So we go back a long way. Larry Stafford, whose dad ran one of the music stores in town, and Hugh Stafford, it was almost like the musical clubhouse in town. On Saturday mornings, all the musicians would gather down there and be trying out guitars and seldom buying anything. Like Huey had a lot of patience for us, but he was a real saint. And Stanley Fawcett, of course, would come in, the legendary Stan the Man, and
tambourine.
Give him a quarter to shovel the snow outside the store, and Stanley would get up and play tambourine. So it was, and those guys were local heroes to us, because again, there wasn't much rock and roll on TV. So as a high school student, you'd go to the dances at LC and QE and Frontenac and KC, and stand. All the wannabe musicians would stand up front with their arms crossed, watching all these local guys and their bands, and kind of talking about guitars or trying to cop a lick or something like that. So it was a little scene, and I'm still in touch with some of those people through Facebook to this day, and it was a great time. The late 60s was a wonderful time to be a teenager, and Kingston was a great place to be because of also we had all these great bands coming through, international acts, because bands weren't flying from gig to gig back then. And so if they were playing Toronto or Montreal, they would often stop in Kingston on the way. So we got to see The Who and Genesis and Paul Butterfield and Paul Revere and the Raiders and The Lovin' Spoonful, and all these bands, came through, and everybody in Kingston went, because if you were a teenager in the late 60s, there were no video games, there was no internet. The music was what kind of bound us together. So you spent almost all your disposable income was going for records or concerts or dances. Music was a real common bond to now it's more of a I know my daughters, for them, it's a little more of a background thing, because they're online, and for boys, it's video games is a big thing. But then it was all about the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five, and the bands that we were interested in. There, the music was a really, really big force in everybody's life. Then you never went anywhere without a radio. You always had the radio with you.
One of your previous bandmates passed along a recording that was made back in 1973 in the Blink Bonnie Hotel in Gananoque with you singing lead vocals. How do you feel about singing lead?
Anybody who hears that tape knows why I was never a lead singer in a band. I came to the realization pretty early on that I was better off on the other side of the glass. What somebody say the other day, I had a great face for radio. But yeah, often then, so that your lead singer wouldn't get their voice burned out. Because back then you had to play 4 40-minute sets a night. People forget this. You had to be able to do 40 songs. Like, you didn't even go to see Bernie Dobbin to get a gig until you had 40 songs. So you would rehearse for 12 weeks or so and learn a bunch of songs. And if your lead singer was singing everything, it would burn their voice out over the course of a 6-nighter in a bar. So usually a couple guys in the band would do songs that didn't require a lot of vocal quality, or you do an instrumental. And so I ended up doing Flip, Flop, and Fly and a couple of other rock and roll tunes where you didn't really have to be a good singer. Just, if nothing else, just to give our lead singer a rest. When I was in second year Queens, we played 165 nights that year. I've got a little journal with a list of all the gigs. We played that many nights. I was living at home and making almost as much money as my dad was working at Wilmot's Dairy.
Really? That's crazy.
Because the other thing was, life was cheap. I mean, tuition at Queens in 1971 was $600 a year. So if our little band was getting $600 for a 3-nighter, and you didn't have a sound man and you didn't have a light man, like it was just the band. So each guy came home with $200. Well, $200 in 1971, I mean, you work for 3 weeks, you'd have your tuition,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
A lot of money.
and we were living at home, you know, and my parents were wonderful about that. And I lived at home all through Queens, and, you know, they put up with bands rehearsing in their basement from the time I was 12 till the time I was 22. I don't know, you know, you come upstairs and my mom would be straightening up the paintings on the wall. My dad would have the hockey game on stun in the den, but they were remarkably supportive of my music endeavors, you know, back in those days. And I guess as long as I stayed in school, they were happy with that. And it was, you know, they're still very, very, I mean, my parents still live in Kingston. They're both 94 now, and they still live in Kingston. They still live in that same house, you know, so it's, I was back there at Christmas, and we had the typical, you know, 60s suburban Kingston rec room with an acoustic tile in the ceiling. And there are divots in the ceiling from Tim Aylesworth and those guys taking their guitars off and accidentally hitting the ceiling when they took off the guitars. And my mom says, I'm never going to get those fixed. That reminds me of the times with you and your friends down in the basement and all the good times you guys had. And, you know, it's pretty, it just kind of shows how much they I don't know if I'd put up with it. And yet they put up with all that noise for a long, long time.
That goes a long way to encouraging you when you were younger.
They were very welcoming. And again, you got to remember, this is like a basement full of long hairs in the 60s. Like, they took some flack from the neighbors over it for sure. But my dad says, well, some dads had to get up at 5 a.m. and make a hockey rink. And he says, I had to put up with rock bands in the basement for, you know, he said, at least we knew where you were.
That's right.
So
now, you went to Queens and you enrolled in commerce. And when you graduated, you moved to Toronto to be the mild-mannered computer programmer for the TD Bank by day.
Yes.
And then by night, you were becoming the super sound engineer, recording different bands in different situations. So tell us about that particular circumstance when you were in Toronto.
Well, I moved up to Toronto in the summer of 75, the week after I graduated from Queens. And I knew I couldn't make a living in Kingston as a computer programmer. I think really the only place in Kingston that had computer staff back then was Empire Life Insurance. If you didn't get a job there, you wouldn't work. And so that was back, it's so long ago, you know, the companies in Toronto would send recruiters down to Queens and interview 50 or 60 people. And the accounting companies would come down, and the banks would come down, and the insurance companies. And everybody in my graduating year in 75 had 7 or 8 job offers. Like the commerce degree with any sort of computing background was a big deal then. And so I got job offers from Burroughs in Ottawa and Manulife in Toronto and a bunch of different companies. And I ended up at the bank, and they were so starved for computer people. We didn't have to wear suits and ties and you were on flexible time. As long as you worked a 35-hour week, they didn't really care when you came in, which really dovetailed with my music career. Because I'd record I'd work at the bank during the day and then come home and have some band come in at night and probably record till 2 in the morning. But then I could sleep in, because I didn't have to be at work at 9. I could sleep in till 11 and go to work. And so I did that for about 3 years. And at first it was, you know, 35 hours a week at the bank and 10 hours a week recording. And then it got to be 20 hours a week recording. And then it got to be 30 hours a week recording. And at that point, by about 1978, I had the little studio in the basement of a house in East York, and I was working, you know, 70 hours a week at the 2 jobs, and something had to give. And I had to make a decision. Do I want to be bank guy or do I want to be recording guy? And so I handed in my resignation at the bank. And
question for you.
My folks were horrified. Like, it was like, you're giving up the bank.
What are you doing?
For the music industry, it was like giving up the priesthood or something like that. You know, and so, but they were cool about it. But it's just, you know, I knew my income was going to drop instantly. But it, you know, it's worked out. You know, and I probably would have.
Question: where did the passion come from to sort of switch, going back a little bit to when you were still in Kingston, going from performing the music to managing the music and recording the music? Like, where did that switch come and why?
I think probably by about second year Queens, I realized I was never going to be a good enough bass player or singer to make a living as a musician. You know, it was a hobby that I could make a little money with. And I just got, I should back up, because there's somebody I haven't mentioned that was kind of key to all this. And there was a friend of mine I went to high school with named Sanjay Luthra. And he was a year older than me. And he went to Queens a year before I did and got involved with CFRC radio. And he was really,
that's where I met him. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was really into live recording. And he had a reel-to-reel Sony tape deck. I can still see it. And we would take that thing down. Back then, there was a couple of coffee houses in Kingston that featured solo folk music entertainers and people like Bruce Coburn and Jesse Winchester and Murray McLaughlin, people that were just starting out in the folk scene that actually went on to bigger things. But people were a lot less uptight about bootlegs back then. And Sanjay would ask, "Oh, do you mind if I come down Friday night and tape your show?" And people were happy to get it done. And so there was the Razor's Edge on Princess Street, which was right beside the Capitol Theater, upstairs. Before that, it had been called the First Church of Alice, which is a pretty 60s name. I remember they had a big giant paper mache mushroom in the place. And the Bitter Grounds Coffee House, which was in the Student Union building at Queens in the basement, sort of not far from where Alfie's Pub is now, if that's still there. There was a coffee house at Clark Hall, upstairs in Clark Hall for a while, where the Queen's bookstore is now. And people like Sneezy Waters, the Ontario folk circuit was quite strong, and there was a bunch of rotating people that would go through there. And Sanjay would go down, and I'd help him, and we'd set up a couple of audience mics and a mic on the guitar and a mic on the vocal. So you didn't need a lot of gear. And then he got to the point where he was working at the CFRC enough that he could borrow some good microphones and good mixers, not consoles, but little mixers from those guys. And we had pretty good quality equipment and going down and taping those things. And then he had a folk show on, I think, Sunday nights on CFRC, and he would air these live recordings that we did. So I kind of got the bug for the immediacy of recording a band or a performer live and seeing the audience reaction in real time. And rather than sitting in the studio and spending 10 hours on one song, going out and recording 25 songs in one night, that became appealing to me. Another guy that was influential in that was another KCVI, a guy I knew from KCVI who was a couple years older than me, but went on to become the station manager at CFRC. And that was a guy named Steve Cutway, who was blind.
Very good friend of mine, yeah.
Oh, well, Stephen was I knew Stephen growing up, and he recorded some of the bands I was in. I remember bringing our little folk trio into Dunning Hall, and Steve brought in some recording equipment from CFRC, and I still have the tape recordings of our little bluegrass folk trio. And this was you were talking about epiphanies and moments like that. We went back over to CFRC, and Steve took an applause sound effects reel and added this theater applause to our little Dunning Hall tape. And I was like, "You can do that?" Like, wow. It was like, wow, it sounds like we're at Carnegie Hall. And I think that was a little bit of a light bulb over the head moment that wow, you can actually create this thing that didn't really happen with the magic of recording. So Stephen was very instrumental in that, and was sort of part of my circle of friends back then. And so those two gentlemen were real mentors to me getting started. I'm still in touch with, I've lost track of Steve, but I'm still in touch with Sanjay. Steve, yeah. A little side story for Stephen. I worked for a while out at the Frontenac Mall at a stereo store called International Sounds that sold a lot of Telefunken and Grundig, and sort of the guy who ran it was German, and so he had all this European gear. And he wanted to go back to Germany, so he eventually just declared bankruptcy and closed the business down. We showed up for work one day and the doors were locked. So about a month later, they had a big auction to sell off all the equipment in the store to pay off some of the debts. And Steve was at the auction, and they auctioned off all the stuff at the front of the store, all the stereo systems and speakers and high quality turntables and all that stuff. And once they got back to the back, it was just the shop, the workshop. And they were just, had random boxes of wires and repair parts. And the auctioneer held up this box about the size of a book, size of an encyclopedia book, and said, "How much do I hear for this box?" And Stephen goes, $50. And everybody's kind of turning around and going, "Oh man, the poor blind guy is like bidding on this cardboard box of, crap." And so nobody else bid. He got the box. They opened it up, and inside it were 50 Shure cartridges, V15 turntable cartridges. They were, at that time, they were about $100 a piece. So he got $5,000 worth of turntable cartridges for $50. I can remember that like it was yesterday.
You move up to Toronto, and you are recording people in your little studio in East York.
Yep.
And at some particular point, somebody's asking you to come out and do remote recordings.
Yep.
And tell us about the environment in Toronto at that time for remote recording.
Again, it was long enough ago that there was Chum FM had a weekly folk music show. And since I had been recording these folk coffee house things in Kingston, I somehow Well, the first musicians that I knew when I moved to Toronto were people from Kingston that had moved up to Toronto. And so that was Mark Haynes, Colleen Peterson.
Yeah.
They were my sort of initial contacts, the only musicians I knew in Toronto. So I started recording them, and then I started recording their friends that would drop by during their sessions, and it kind of pyramided out from that. And so I became known, I guess, in Toronto in the folk scene first, and Chum FM started bringing me along to like one of those acts would be doing one of their folk shows at the Groaning Board restaurant on Bay Street. And they say, Doug is doing all our studio work now. Could he come down and kind of be the producer? And so I got in pretty well with the Chum FM folks and started doing their weekly folk music shows. And I still didn't have a truck. We'd set up in the basement of the restaurant with some gear in an office or in a coat check room backstage somewhere.
So were they live recordings you were doing direct
yes.
to the radio? Okay.
Yes. And they would have Bell telephone lines running right to the radio station. And it was a weekly thing. And we did like David Wilcox and Stan Rogers and John Hammond and people that were coming through. And simultaneous to this, Chum was doing almost weekly rock and roll shows from a bar called the El Macombo. And the crew doing that was a guy named John Cordina and Mike Elder and Ed Weidman. They had a company called Hammerhead Audio, and they did a lot of famous shows there. They did Meatloaf and Elvis Costello and Todd Rundgren. And again, you had to realize there was no internet and there was no MTV, no much music. And so if a record company wanted to promote a new act, the best way to get them attention in town when they were coming through, a new band, was to do one of these live 1 hour radio broadcasts on Chum FM, which was the big station at the time. So the record companies would subsidize this because it was effectively getting an hour on the radio of their band. Well, around 1979, sadly, Ed Weidman, one of these three gentlemen that was doing the shows at the Elmo, was killed in a car crash. And the other two guys just didn't have the heart to keep the company going. They kind of lost interest, I guess. And so Warren Cosford, who was the head of special promotions for Chum, phoned me up and said, Doug, you've been doing a good job on these folk shows every week. And the guys doing the rock shows at the Elmo don't want to do them anymore. Do you think you have enough equipment to go and do some of these rock shows for us? And so, yeah, okay. And so in February of 1980, I started doing these live to air rock shows at the Elmo Combo. And we did some fairly major bands. We did Stevie Ray Vaughan there, and Joan Jett, and Clarence Clemens from the Springsteen Band, and Mick DeVille, and the Waterboys. And then it reached a point where not just around that time, two new stations came on the air, two new rock stations in Toronto, CFNY and Q107. And they started doing live broadcasts. So for a while there, between about 81 and 86, we were doing live radio broadcasts for all three of those radio stations. And we'd be doing 2 or 3 a week. It was we at the El Macombo alone, we did 130 shows at the El Macombo over those 5 or 6 years.
So you're still lugging equipment from your studio into the club?
Up to about 1979. And then it reached a point where we started renting a little. I got involved with a company called Fantasy Sound that was doing institutional recording. They would record high school bands and church choirs and the RCMP band and the Dofasco or the General Motors choir. And so you'd go and record those people, and then they get 1,000 LPs pressed up and sell them off the stage and use that to raise money to send their band to a competition in Chicago or something. So they had a little 1/4-ton pickup truck with a camper on the back and a little 12-channel console and a 4-track tape deck inside this thing. And it was very top heavy. The camper was too big for the pickup. And we got a gig on New Year's Eve doing actually a bunch of people that went to Queens. Kirk Elliott and Sharon Keats had a band called Short Turn, and we were recording them on New Year's Eve 78 at the Groaning Board. And at the end of the gig, we went to drive the truck back to my studio, and the truck hit a patch of black ice on Davenport Road by Bay Street, and the truck flipped over on its side. And I was renting this truck from Fantasy Sound, and we totaled their truck. It was destroyed the camper, wrecked a lot of my gear. Luckily, nobody was hurt. And so I had to tell these guys that I'd wrecked their truck. And they had gone down. They weren't even in town. They'd gone to Venezuela for the Christmas holidays. So they got back in January, and I had to phone them up. And the guy's name was Irv Fisher. And I remember phoning Irv and saying, Irv, we had a big problem while you were gone. We flipped your mobile over, and it's totaled. It's a write-off. And I thought, I'm thinking this is over. I'm going to have to quit. I'm going to have to move back to Kingston. Like my whole music career. And he said, did anybody get hurt? I said, no. He says, wow. He says, that's great news. We were going to sell that truck and we'll get way more from the insurance than we would have selling it. So you actually solved a problem for us. Click. And I was like, did that just happen? But I had all these jobs lined up and no truck. So what that did, that thing that seemed like a tragedy at the time, it forced me into going out and getting a bank loan and buying my own little truck. And so I bought a Dodge Cube van, and we couldn't afford 2 sets of gear. So we still used the gear from my studio, but we put it all on casters, on wheels, in racks, so that we could easily wheel it out into the truck, go do a job, drive back to the studio, wheel it all back out and set it up in the studio for a show the next day. And we did that for many years, that little Cube van we had for about 6 years. And it started out as a 4-track, and then it went 8-track, 16-track, 24-track. And by this time, we were also not in the house anymore in East York. I had received a letter from the zoning people in Toronto saying, like, somebody had complained about me running a business on this little residential street. And the city said, we understand you're running a business in a residentially zoned area, and you have 2 weeks to shut it down, or we're going to shut you down. And so again, it was like a big panic. I thought, I've sunk 30 grand into soundproofing this basement, and now I have to move. And I had to find a storefront. So I looked and found a abandoned sign painting shop up at Dufferin and Rogers Road. And we moved up there in the summer of around 78, I guess. And so that was a legitimate studio. So now I had my own truck, and I had a not a basement studio anymore. And I started getting calls from CBC and people like that, and was like, well, how come you didn't call us before? Well, you were in a basement, and it was kind of a Mickey Mouse thing, and now you're a legit studio. So that, I probably should have made that move earlier, but at the time it was a crisis, and
you were forced into it.
Yeah, but it forced me to go big or go home.
There's a story I read in one of the pages of information, and that's the situation that you experienced with Chum FM and City TV, and how that all evolved, and what was the circumstance at the time in terms of TV stations and their sound.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a cool story. Around 1980 or so, Chum bought City TV in Toronto, and they wanted to uniquely identify that station as not being the station of situation comedies and traditional news and traditional stuff. They wanted to be movies, music, news. And so since they owned a radio station and a television station, and the sound on television then was terrible, it was mono and it was just a little tiny speaker, they started doing what they called stereo simulcasts, where the listener was encouraged to put their big stereo speakers on either side of their television. Again, this is pre-MTV, pre-Much Music. Put your speakers on either side of the television, tune your television to channel 79 for the picture, and tune your radio to Chum FM to get FM quality stereo sound. And they would do live shows from the El Macombo or from the Ryerson Theater or the concert hall downtown, and these were called stereo simulcasts, and they kind of became appointment television. They became very popular, and at first City TV's own audio people did the sound for these shows, even though the audio was broadcast on Chum. But in 1981 they came up to Kingston to record the Boomtown Rats at the Memorial Center, I think. And so the City guys went up with their audio truck, and they came back. This wasn't live to air. It was going to be mixed back at the studio. So they brought the tapes back to a studio a week later, only to find that they had somehow screwed up and none of the guitars got recorded. Two of the 16 tracks did not record. And so Warren Cosford from Chum, the guy that I was dealing with for the radio broadcast, phoned me up and said, Doug, he says, I had to call Bob Geldof and tell him that we had no guitars on his TV show and that we have to overdub them. So he said we had to fly the tapes to Winnipeg, where they were the next night, book a studio on the only day off that the band had on the tour, have the two guitar players come in and overdub all the guitar parts for 15 songs.
Really?
He said, I never want to make a phone call like that again. You've been doing a really good job on our radio shows at the Elmo. I'm going to call Marcy Martin over at City, the producer, and say they should start using your company to do the audio for these simulcasts, because ultimately the audio is airing on our radio station. I'm responsible for the audio on these shows. And obviously these TV guys, they do news, they do sports. They're not really music guys. They're a bit out of their depth. Mm-hmm. And so I had the meeting a week later with Marcy, and she says, we're doing a show next week. Can you do it? It's Todd Rundgren at the O'Keefe Center. And I went, yikes. Because up to then I'd done all these little tiny bar gigs. I hadn't really done a theater. I do remember doing that Todd Rundgren gig in April of 81, I guess it was. And all I had were little 20-foot mic cables, for doing the Elmo combo.
Yeah.
And it's like 250 feet out to the balcony at the O'Keefe Center for audience mics. And I can remember the union guys kind of cursing as they strung together all my little short cables to get the audience mics out to the balcony. So I was kind of in over my head, but we pulled it off. And that was the start of my doing stuff for television and radio at the same time.
I told you he was a great storyteller. Doug McClement, born and raised here in Kingston, now based in Toronto. More stories to come in part 2 of our conversation, coming in 2 short weeks. And here's a bit of a teaser. Doug tells a great story about Burton Cummings. You'll love it. Join us then. This conversation was recorded in March 2021 using Zoom.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.